We're continuing to follow the progress of the good news as it spreads from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, as we see as the command from Jesus in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. And we've been following through the book of Acts, and we've been following Paul recently and his team, who've just for the past couple of chapters made the significant leap into Europe with the gospel. And as Paul is going to anywhere, he kicks up a fuss seemingly anywhere he goes. And in chapter 17 that we're focusing on today, first of all, he's in Thessalonica, and he goes to the synagogue there, and people kick up a fuss, the Jews who react to his message. So he's sent on to Berea, which is a bit more calm, but then the thugs come along again, cause a bit of trouble. So his team send Paul off to Athens for a bit of a break. And it says Silas and Timothy remain, I suspect, to tidy up the mess. So Paul is sent off on a city break. Now, I think that means for Paul, don't break the city. It's time to have a break in a city. And so Paul is wandering around Athens. And it's incredibly, this passage, these events in Acts 17 are incredibly interesting. They're significant. And I think pertinent for us as the gospel here comes face to face with the prevailing cultural philosophies and ideologies of the world in that day. So Paul's walking around Athens, waiting for his mates to turn up, and it's a stunning place. It still is today. Go and visit it today, the Acropolis and all the ruins. But back in its heyday, the marble, the porticos, the outstanding architecture, the melting pot of people, it must have been quite overwhelming. And it says, while Paul was waiting for them, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. And it says later that he walked around and carefully looked at the objects of worship. You see, the first thing Paul saw amidst all the wonder and the beauty at the center of the civilized world, it could have been easy for Paul to be distracted by the spectacle and the beauty. Instead, he observed what was really going on. The city was full of idols. Now, this wouldn't have been the first time Paul would have seen pagan temples to the gods, Zeus and his chums. It was the scale of the idolatry. It seemed to be everywhere, at the very heart of the world, of the cultural heart of the world of ancient Greco-Roman culture. Here, it was literally swamped by idols. That's what the Greek word says, to the point that a Greek poet, Xenophon, once said it's easier to find a god in Athens than it is a man. There's more idols there than in all the rest of the country. And for us, even here in these verses 16 and 23, there's something for us, because we can be utterly dazzled by the size and scale and splendor of everything that makes up our contemporary culture, our world of social progress wrapped up in rapid technological advances and discoveries, which without reflection, without careful looking at, can challenge or change entire society and culture uncritically. It's interesting that lately there's been a lot of news coverage about artificial intelligence, which we're not going to go into all the pros and cons of that. But it is interesting that some of the highest researchers are encouraging a slowdown, a stepping back, and a careful look of what this means for us. Now, you may be sat there thinking, oh, this looks just too big for me, all this concepts and philosophy. Trust me, it's not. What at the very start we're encouraged to do here is to observe and to think critically about what's going on around us, to sense out the big story, the big narrative that's going on. What are the messages that we're receiving? And this is what Paul did. He saw, and his response is that he reacted to it. He felt something. Now, this is not, it says he was greatly distressed, and this is not like a point of view, readers to the broadsheets saying a letter of complaint from distressed of Tarsus. He's not bewailing the state of Athens in a way of, it's not like it was in my day. More than being grumpy and disapproving, the Greek word is paroxysm, and it's associated with a seizure. It's about being provoked. It's not a common New Testament word, but it is used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament in books like Isaiah and Exodus and Deuteronomy. And it's used in the context of God being provoked to anger. And what is he angry at? He's angry at idolatry, the theft and usurping of his glory, his position, his honor. And attached to that is a sense of being jealous, not how we use it, but about being angry at something being taken which doesn't belong to someone else. And God says in Isaiah 42, I'm the Lord, that's my name. I'm not going to yield my glory to another or my praise to idols. And so Paul's response is coming from a place which is for a passion for God's name. He was watching all these thousands of people accepting the norm of being swamped by devotion to bits of stone and metal, and the dehumanizing slavery which idol worship led to then and now. Let's not be coy about this. I associate this reaction less with annoyance and judgmentalism, but more a despair for the lost, akin to when Jesus was looking at Jerusalem, and we have it in Matthew 23 and Luke 19, where he weeps over Jerusalem. Are we ever moved like this anymore? When we regularly pray, hallowed be your name, and yet aren't seemingly bothered by the fact that the majority of people don't hallow his name. Now, please hear me. This is not about a we're right, they're wrong vitriol, but a desperation for those who are lost. I don't even know if we think in those terms as much anymore. Or are we unaware of how influenced we've become even in our own theology, that we've forgotten concepts of sin and judgment as well as grace? Dare I say, do we even think of the words heaven and hell? Reading some of the stories of William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, and his vision for the lost, of an ocean of desperate souls that are lost, and a church disinterested in it on a platform of safety. Keith Green wrote a song similarly about it called Asleep in the Light. One writer once said, we don't speak like Paul because we don't feel like Paul did. So what did Paul do in response to this feeling, this provocation? You can imagine a firebrand like Paul might have lost his temper and reacted and been on a first century soapbox denouncing the evil pagans and threatening them with the fires of hell. Or perhaps more sedately walking around tutting disapprovingly at the filthy damned pagans and their evil unclean practices, waiting for his friends to arrive to have a right old moan at the state of the world. Because I think that's kind of how the church sometimes has reacted over the years. But Paul didn't tut and retreat and stay away. Instead, he engaged, and it says he looked carefully and daily engaged with people in the marketplace. He got stuck back in again, perhaps with a renewed vigor and passion for sharing the gospel. He did his usual strategy. He went to the synagogue and shared the good news with Jews and Gentiles the way he'd done for years. But he didn't just stay there. He actually went into what would be considered alien new territory. He goes to the marketplace, the agora. Day by day, it says he was there, along with the locals, the ordinary people. He was talking with them, listening to them. It was a place where it wasn't just for grocery shopping. It was an exchange of gossip and ideas, and people loved to reflect about the latest ideas and beliefs and wrestle with their own, especially as Roman Empire opened up so many mixing of cultures. Paul speaks with anyone who was there. And amongst the people who were there were some philosophers, the Epicureans and the Stoics. Now, even mentioning their names and the concept of philosophy, maybe for some of you got fired up about intellectual speculative rigor, and others have ruled yourself out saying it's too big for my head. Well, I don't think that's necessarily so, because I think these schools of thought are still evident today. And to try and illustrate that, let's zoom into two guys who are in the audience, who are in the crowd, Eric and Stuart. Eric thinks that the gods, if they exist, they're far off, remote. They've got no interest or engagement with us in the world. Everything's random, based on chance. You can't control anything. There's no big meaning to life, so just kick back, get on with it, live your best life. That's a modern phrase, one that we might recognize as eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. We see that in some passages of scripture. We see it in the work of Epicurus. That's Eric. And then we have Stuart. And Stuart thinks that there are gods, or there's a God, or at least a divine force or something out there. It's also found within us, within all living creatures, the world around us and everywhere. It's the family of humanity. Do your best to be the best person you can be. Everything is ordered and ordained. We are subject to fate, and just whatever will be, will be. Just resign yourself to your fate. Get on with it. It's your lot. Nothing can change. Do you recognize those attitudes? Throw on a couple of white bed sheets and curly beards and you've got Epicureans and Stoics. And Paul engages with them, and he gets ridiculed. He gets called a babbler of pointless little substance ideas. He gets accused of introducing foreign gods, just like Socrates, the great philosopher, was condemned for many years before. And who are these foreign gods? Jesus and his consort Anastasis. Jesus and resurrection. They thought that these were two new gods that he was bringing. Now we may think, oh, how simplistic, but it fit in with their framework, their spiritual outlook of many gods and goddesses. And this demonstrates something for us. There is such a lot of misunderstanding, even in our day and age, about Christianity and Jesus. And what Paul was saying, just like many things today, sounded like nonsense to them. And one of the key differences, perhaps, in our context and there that Paul had in Athens, is that he was in a pre-Christian world where they didn't know anything about Jesus or the Gospels. We're not there now. We're in a post-Christian society where the general feeling is Christianity, even a parody of itself, has been tried, tested, and found wanting. Been there, done that, and it doesn't work, it doesn't fit anymore. And we find that engaging with people on the streets in alpha courses, not that people don't know some things about Jesus and the church, although that is increasingly the case, but there's a lot of unpacking of baggage, dispelling of myths and misconceptions, and addressing past hurts with the church before we even get to sharing the gospel. But the people, the Epicureans and Stoics, the Stoics, are intrigued enough with what Paul says to know more. And it's true that people do want to know more. They're more interested than maybe we think sometimes. They want to engage with spiritual matters. Do we? So Paul is taken to the Areopagus. Now this was a rocky outcrop just outside, overlooking the Acropolis. It's translated as the Mars Hill. It's where the court of the people was originally founded. Some legal issues would have been debated there, but it was also the place to wrestle with big ideas. And this has sometimes been equated by writers with the university of the day. It's interesting to note that this is actually less like the universities, I think, but actually what I think it's wider than that. I think it's more akin to influencers. Now, what I mean by influencers, this is a concept which I've only come to realize over the past little while. I've become more aware of this thing called influencers through my son Jacob, who's a social media marketing specialist, and he talks about the role of the influencer. These are people who through media or social media platforms have established a popular following. TikTok, Instagram, blogging and vlogging, they have the power to influence, to tell people what is popular, what is cool, what's acceptable today. Now Paul, he's engaging with people here who are not just the academic clever clogs. They're the influencers of the everyday thinking and the everyday marketplace attitudes. And we need Christians in our places of cultural influence, in the media, including social media and online presence, marketing, in the arts, in advertising, in sports, in academia, in the news and entertainment, in politics. And if that's not you, at least pray for those people who are Christians in those places of cultural influence. So Paul is at the Areopagus with the influencers, the opinion makers, the opinion makers of the day. He's invited because they're interested, or at the very least they're intrigued with what he's saying. And sometimes that's all we get with someone. Intrigued as to why we forsake a Sunday lie-in to get together with a bunch of people and sing songs. Why we give up our time, our money and our energies to help other people. Food parcels, food banks, CAP Debt Centre, befriending, renew well-being, all those things. We've talked about this being what's called the gospel pebble in the shoe, intriguing someone. And they ask, and the same people they ask in Athens, please explain, and Paul does. And what we have here in the Areopagus is Paul's speech. Now, it's probably a summary of what he says, because we kind of gather from the rest of Scripture, Paul goes on and on a bit. So this takes about less than 2 minutes to read, so I suspect it's a summary of the significant bits that Paul is addressing. So Acts 17 from 22 onwards, how does Paul react to them? What does he say to them? Paul could have stuck into them, really criticizing the error of their ways, how wrong they were. He could also have started what he normally did with the Jews about the fact Jesus was the fulfillment of the law of Moses, the long-awaited Messiah coming to save his people, not just from Gentile pagan overlords, but from the law of sin and death to bring them back into a relationship with Yahweh. None of that would have made the slightest bit of sense to these philosophical Greeks. Instead, what is really important for us in interacting with those who aren't yet Christians is what Paul does here. He starts where they are at, not where we think they should be or where others might be. Paul doesn't condemn them. Instead, he commends them. He says, I see in every way you're very religious. He sees what's really going on behind the scenes, so to speak. They're searching for something. And it's understood differently by them than his fellow Jews, and so a different approach is needed. He finds a common ground, a foundation upon which he can build eventually to the story of Christ. And when we read here that the Athenians were very religious, the parallel for us today perhaps is, I see that in so many ways you're very spiritual. This is reflected in the most recent large-scale survey in the UK, the 2021 census. The headlines, you might have picked them up, is for the first time, less than half the population of the UK describe themselves as Christians. It's 46%. It's 13% less than 10 years ago. And whilst Christianity is still the most popular choice in regards to religion, the second most popular description is no religion at all. That's 37% of respondents. That's up 12% from 2011. And if we zoom into Craven itself, our area, 53% are Christian, 38.5% would describe themselves as no religion. This doesn't mean people are necessarily atheist, more likely some form of being agnostic. And the commonest way of understanding that grouping, I think, is they would say that they're spiritual, not religious. One commentator in a book about those who would describe themselves as having no affiliation, he suggests that they're less atheist and more apatheist, just not bothered. And this is from studies in the USA, this apatheist idea. And the UK is not far behind in the surge of apathy in regards to faith and spirituality even. But what it does tell us is that a different approach is needed in how we communicate the gospel to people. Gone are the days of presuming that people would know Bible stories about God, about Jesus, about anything connected with Christianity, apart from an inherited caricature. Paul starts where the Athenians are at, with their questions, their thinking, their outlook. He spent time walking around, getting to know the situation, looking carefully, listening, engaging in order to understand where they're coming from. And his starting point, his springboard, is an idol, an actual pagan idol to an unknown God. Now, the Greeks had a pantheon of 12 Olympian gods and goddesses. We're familiar with their names: Zeus, Apollo, Hades, all those people that reflected significant aspects of humanity and human life, which they deified. They would have had many more idols, temples, and shrines to multiple lesser gods, but the reasoning for this altar to an unknown God, I wonder if the first reason is because they were afraid of missing someone. It's like that scene in a movie called The Mummy, where there's a guy who is being chased by the eponymous nasty, evil mummy, and he's got loads of religious symbols around his neck, and when he encounters the mummy, he brings up one at a time to see which one will work to ward off the evil that's nearby him. Just in case we missed one, we have an altar to an unknown God. But maybe the other way of looking at it is that it's an altar less to an unknown God and read to an unknowable God. And both of those reasons for this idol, I think, reflect both the Epicureans and the Stoics, and I think it also reflects many people's thinking today. Paul is saying that thing you're searching for, what you're desperately reaching out into the void for, that missing piece in your life that you just can't seem to fill that gap, let me introduce you to them. Let me introduce you. Let me make what is unknown to you, let's make it known. So Paul, in one speech that we see summarized here, he brings the gospel to them. But he's got to start much further back than he's used to with the Jews. And in so doing, he masterfully addresses both Epicureans and Stoics in their thinking. He doesn't start by telling them they're wrong. That would stop any engagement, wouldn't it? He starts with where they're right. He starts with their self-proclaimed ignorance but seeking. He tells them what is good, what is true, what is right. And he starts off with God, the active creator, not the Epicurean everything happens by chance, and not creation being God as the Stoics liked. He progresses to God who is the sustainer and the provider, who doesn't need temples built by hands or for us to bring him stuff. He's given it to us. And the Epicureans, they're nodding their heads. That religious nonsense is not needed. But Paul doesn't stop there. Not only is God creator and sustainer, he is also involved to the point he is Father. There is relationship involved. His heart is that people would actually reach out to him, reflecting that there is a gap, a disjointing between us and God. He said, because he is not far away, you Epicureans. God is not only knowable, he wants to be known. And to hit this home, Paul even quotes two of their own pagan poets off the top of his head, seemingly. Epimenides of Crete and Aratus, a 3rd century Stoic. He says he's using his own writers to refute their own thinking as a point of connection with them. So Paul must have read them, heard about them, absorbed these pagan poets, so now can use them as a connection point. Like modern day video clips, TV shows, stories in the news, popular songs, even a knowledge of the inconsistency in some modern day ideologies. So given all this, Paul says, how can the Creator be like metal or stone or anything else made by humans who are actually made by God? And Paul uses all these things, starting with where the Athenians are at, using their own thought processes, even quoting some of their own regarded writers to make the gospel accessible. You see, when people go to be missionaries to spread the gospel in foreign lands that they haven't been to before, there's a couple of basic prime tasks. The first task is to learn the language in order to communicate. The second is to understand the culture, to know how things work there, how conventions happen, how people think, how people act. And using that knowledge, use that knowledge to translate the gospel into a way that people will understand, in a language they will understand. I'm always impressed by our friends, our Ukrainian friends, who sit through our services and are just putting up with us going on in English and not necessarily being able to completely grasp the picture. I'm so impressed. I wish I could speak better Ukrainian and Russian to help you. But the thing is, it's not, in this context, not just about the language. Paul talks about Jesus and resurrection in Greek, but they think he's talking about two new gods. There's the cultural matrix that he's dealing with too. So in order to communicate the gospel effectively to any culture, it needs to be made accessible to them. To make it easy for someone to hear and to understand the gospel, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 9, I've become all things to all people, so that by all means possible I might save some. You get a real sense of Paul's desperation here. He wants people, he's desperate for people to get to hear the gospel however they need to hear it. But the danger in making the gospel accessible. I'm not just talking about making it cool and trendy. I'm not talking about middle-aged pastors dressing like young hipsters to facilitate the gospel, although it's not far off from that. The danger of trying to be so culturally relevant is that we might become evangelistically vacant, so desperate to make the gospel accessible that it spills over into trying to make it acceptable. A good friend of ours from the church, a guy called Rob White, some of you remember him, I was discussing with him this concept of being culturally relevant as a gospel, and he was wary. He said we should reflect on that, because isn't the whole point that the gospel stands outside a prevailing culture so it can speak prophetically into it? Should the gospel not actually be culturally irrelevant? Now, I know what he's getting at. I don't entirely agree, but I know what he means. I think it's about, in the attempt to make the gospel accessible, we end up making it acceptable, palatable, watered down, nice and friendly and cuddly. And it's because maybe we want to fit in as well, to feel accepted. But we see it here in the Areopagus. We see Paul, if we stop where we just did, and where we've done so far, that we're all children of Creator God, who God's made us, provides for us, wants to know us. He can't be made of stone and metal. If he stopped there, he might be fine, but he did the thing that you shouldn't do if you want the gospel to be socially acceptable. He brought Jesus into it. I'm talking about the real Jesus, not the good moral teacher, the social revolutionary Jesus, but Jesus, God made flesh, God with us, the firstborn over all creation, the one who is able to judge rightly, to restore things and to make things new. He is the one who hung on a cross, faced the full-on consequence of our corporate and cumulative human idolatry. Metal to money, gold to gluttony, stone to selfism, all of those onto him. And Paul brings Jesus up. Now, he's sometimes been criticized here in this episode for not mentioning the cross. Well, a couple of things. First of all, we learn in 1 Corinthians that the Greeks scoff at the concept of the crucifixion. We also gather this is only a summary of the key things that Paul spoke of in that time. And he kind of must have spoken about the cross in some way, because he talks about resurrection, and resurrection has got to come from somewhere. It comes from death. But notice this. It's at this point that the snaring happened, at this point where the meeting abruptly ends. As I've said before, talk about God, the divine spark, even the wonder of God in creation. Speak of spirituality, practices, habits, and you may get lots of buy-in from those outside the church. Bring up Jesus, and it gets awful lot harder. Peter writes in 1 Peter 2, verse 8, he talks about Jesus, the living stone, as a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. He is a stumbling block. The gospel must be made accessible, but it mustn't lose its power by making it culturally acceptable. The packaging, the process, the points of connection for the gospel can be vastly varied. In fact, they need to be in order to make the gospel understandable to people. We see this in Paul's interactions here and in other places. But the message of Jesus must stay the same. Otherwise, it's not the gospel. As has been said, Paul has been criticized by some writers. Even early century writer called Tertullian said, what's Athens got to do with Jerusalem? Why use philosophy to wrestle with God stuff that's basically to do with the church? Suggesting that making the gospel accessible using cultural connection points is not good, that it leads to a watering down of the gospel. And as we said, Paul didn't use the cross here, so it's not a full gospel. Critics often say this missionary venture was actually a failure. I kind of disagree. I think the gospel of Jesus Christ is fully here. I think Paul is speaking a language and concepts that his listeners would understand. And he's not talking about things that would have they would have no cultural idea about. He starts further back in the evangelism process than maybe some would like. Some people call this apologetics, clearing the way for the gospel message, speaking about the gospel in language that people understand before we get to talk about the Bible even. Paul had a blank slate with regards to Christianity. We are in a kind of scorched earth post-Christian society where many have rejected the church outright. I don't think this was actually a failure. It's not all about mass numbers, remember. A significant member of the Areopagus, he becomes a follower. A woman named Damaris, amongst many others, become followers. A number sneered, but a number remained intrigued and interested, wanting to know more. People wanted more. A reminder that even in this context, we all play different parts in the bringing of the gospel to people. Some break the ground, some sow the seed, some water it, and some harvest it. Paul is breaking up some pretty hard ground here. And was it a failure? Well, the last time I looked, I noticed there was a church that was alive in Athens and the Acropolis is standing in ruins. So, to wrap things up, Paul saw what was really going on in Athens, that it was swamped with idols. He saw the desperate reaching out to fill the God gap in people's lives and the idolizing of human traits and desires. He felt provoked about this, that God's name and glory were being dishonored. Recognizing that was come from a place of ignorance, he didn't complain or condemn. He was passionate about the lost. And he did something about it. He got to sharing the gospel again, initially in his usual spots and then on the streets and the marketplace, alien territory where he was misunderstood, yet it caused intrigue. And then he said something, starting where the Athenians were at, speaking their language, addressing their understanding and their questions, using their words and their ideas. He started from real basics and built up. James Emery White writes in his book, The Rise of the Nuns, he said, on Mars Hill, the spiritual illiteracy was so deep that Paul had to begin with cultural touchstones, lead into creation and work forward. It took him a while to get to Christ, but to Christ he got. Because this was about making the gospel accessible to a new audience with whom old, tried and tested patterns, packaging, process and points of connection were completely different and wouldn't have worked. But the message was not different. Paul saw, he felt, he acted, and he spoke. Maybe we don't speak because we don't put ourselves into positions, places, and with people in order to speak. Maybe we don't put ourselves in those positions because we don't feel the importance or the passion for God's name, and that people don't know him and are spiritually lost. Maybe we don't feel because we've stopped looking and seeing what's really going on, and the desperate reaching out for people to know God, but to know him in a language and in a way that they understand in order to reach out and to hear the real message of Jesus.